What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. On the surface, it looked like another one of those annual rituals Putin and Lukashenko staged to prove they're still brothers in arms. A meeting in a monastery, a backdrop of holy walls, and the promise of a calm ceremonial appearance. But what unfolded was not calm, was not ceremonial, and definitely was not flattering. Instead, the spectacle in Valam turned into a bizarre parody of power. What should have been carefully staged PR ended up showing Putin as frail, Lukashenko as bored and frustrated, and the entire Kremlin machine as strangely sloppy. It was supposed to signal strength, but instead it exposed the cracks in the system's image-making apparatus. Behind the bad makeup, the crumpled shirt, the shaky camera, and the ridiculous background noises, actually ridiculous, something bigger was revealed. A regime that has grown so comfortable in its own lies, it cannot even bother to polish them anymore. But let's peel back the curtain. Let's look at what this awkward show really said about Putin, Lukashenko, and the war in Ukraine, and then the Kremlin's obsession with selling death as positive dynamics. For decades, Putin's brand has been built on one simple idea: strength. Shirtless horseback rides, ice plunges, fighter jet cockpits, and endless parades of military uniforms. This was not about policy, it was about image. The Kremlin's PR machine polished every angle, every camera shot, every gesture, until Putin was elevated into something like a myth. He was not just a president, he was a projection of power. And yet, in this monastery meeting, that myth collapsed in real time and very fast. There he was, hunched, wrinkled, dressed in a cheap, crumpled t-shirt that screamed retirement home rather than nuclear power. His hair flapped in the wind like a parody of itself, the microphone picked up gusts of static, and even Lukashenko's dog sniffles. And then the camera shook like it was operated by somebody recovering from a 3-day vodka drinking spree. The most telling part, no one fixed it. No editor cut the audio, no strategist adjusted the seating that made Putin look like a child next to Lukashenko's bulking body. This was not a slip, it was negligence. And negligence at the very heart of the authoritarian system is fatal. The irony is striking. The same man whose regime jails people for posting meme about his aging is now broadcasting to the world as a fragile grandfather slouched on a bench. And this matters because, in a personalist autocracy, the leader's image is not decoration, it is the foundation of the regime. And when that foundation looks weak, the entire structure trembles. What used to be a choreographed ballet of propaganda has become a provincial sitcom. And it's hard to take seriously the man promising conquest of Europe when he looks like he is waiting for a nurse to bring him soup. That's about the visual part of that fiasco, but what about the contents of their conversation? Did they say anything meaningful? Let's summarize the dialogue in our next chapters. Once you get past the visuals, the substance of what Putin and Lukashenko said is not any less absurd. The monastery stage was not chosen for the Russian public, it was for one man, Donald Trump. Putin's every line about negotiations, confidentiality, and calm environment was less about Ukraine and more about whispering sweet nothings to Trump across the ocean. The message was simple. Look, Donald, we are talking. We are open to peace. We are reasonable. The fact that the prisoners of war and bodies are being swapped alongside these talks is in their minds proof of progress. But here is the catch. These negotiations are a sideshow. They are compartmentalized, a neat little performance intended to draw attention from the actual war. On one side, Putin teams discuss exchanges and frameworks. On the other, his army grinds towns into dust. He insists that the war must continue until root causes are eliminated, which in Kremlin speak means nothing less than Ukraine's destruction as a sovereign state. There is no compromise here, no settlement waiting in the winds, just an endless loop, talks that never conclude, war that never ends, and the hope that the Western audiences will confuse activity for diplomacy. That is the whole plan, it's always been, and not even a very clever one. But it works, at least on one person. Trump can point to so-called progress on Truth Social, Putin can pretend he's a statesman instead of a warlord, and Lukashenko can nod along while petting his dog. That's exactly pretty much what he was doing all the time. Meanwhile, soldiers die in trenches, drones hover over ruined towns, and the so-called negotiations remain little more than a cover story for slaughter. And by the way, if you think about it, this was probably one of the first meaningful in-person meetings of Putin and Lukashenko since a very long time. The reason for that most likely was growing frustration of Lukashenko with Putin and his unwillingness to literally hear more nonsense. But this recent conversation allowed us to read Lukashenko's subtle hints in his birthing hatred towards that man, towards Putin. Let's talk about this in our next chapter. The most grotesque part of the press conference was not the bad staging or the empty promises of negotiations. It was how Putin and Lukashenko spoke about death. For years, Putin framed war casualties as almost cleansing. Better to die in battle than rot away in drinking, he said. A dehumanizing, brutal philosophy, but at least consistent with his hatred towards ordinary Russians. Now, however, he has changed the packaging. Losses are no longer tragic or shameful. They are not in vain. They are part of a positive so-called dynamic. And just think about what that means. Towns reduced to rubble, thousands dead, entire regions emptied of life, all justified, because in Putin's words, it advances Russia's objectives. Chasiv Yar is the perfect and the most recent example. A town leveled by years of fighting, transformed into ghostly wasteland, and now is held up as a proof of progress. Putin boasts of its capture as though he had taken Paris. The fact that nothing remains, that Ukrainians deny its fall, that the ground itself is uninhabitable, none of that matters. For Putin, the map has one more dot colored red, and that is worth any number of corpses. Lukashenko then chimes in with his own brand of grotesque reality. He compares today's losses to World War II, arguing that since hundreds of thousands died then, the current bloodshed is just merciful by comparison. In his warped arithmetic, fewer bodies than in 1943 equals kindness. It is the kind of logic only dictatorship can produce, turning mass death into statistics, stripping it of humanity, and presenting it as a proof of benevolence. Except this time, the way he spoke was very different than before. The body language, the subtle smirks, eye contact, everything was different. It seemed very likely that a growing disbelief in Putin's goals and objectives. Last time Lukashenko seemed like a rehearsed straight-A student, showing where the attack against Belarus came from on the map. But this time, he was laughing with his eyes when Putin spoke about protecting our people in historical territories. It almost felt like a cry for help. He basically said, "Oh, Vladimir, do you seriously believe in this load of BS that you're talking right now? I mean, thank you for keeping me the president of Belarus, but don't ever ask me to agree with this ridiculousness clownship that comes out of your mouth. Your soldiers might use my territory to do whatever you think you are doing, but don't think about asking me to do more than that. That's your war. Fight it however you want. I want out as soon as possible." That is the kind of body language, that messages that Lukashenko was sending to the viewers. It definitely at least felt that way. Not saying Lukashenko is innocent or anything, but the potential betrayal is definitely on the future table. What lingers most from this event is not Putin's wrinkled shirt or the trembling camera. It is the sheer banality of how evil was presented. Historically, authoritarian regimes cloaked mass murder in spectacle. Hitler had rallies, Stalin had parades, Mussolini had his balcony speeches. Death came wrapped in ideology, thunder, and applause. Putin offers something more insidious: boredom. Two aging men slouched on a bench, mumbling about negotiations, sipping the air like pensioners gossiping in the courtyard. Then a dog sniffs louder than the head of the state. A camera trembles like it cannot hold the weight of history. And through this old performance, they discuss war as it is some kind of a garden project. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, cities flattened, and is spoken of in the same tone as one might use to discuss trade figures or harvest yields, or just culinary experience, I don't know. That's what makes it so sinister. Not the fiery rage of fascism, but the apathetic shrug of men who see human life as background noise. They don't need rallies, they don't need to convince their population of a glorious mission. They have already normalized endless war. It is routine for them, ordinary, eternal, and in that routine lies the darkest truth. People are not dying for victory or ideology or even survival. They're dying because two men in shabby shorts decided they could and they should. The Valam monastery meeting was supposed to remind the world of Russia's so-called stability and its unbreakable alliance with Belarus at least. Instead, it reveals something else: the decay. The strongman image is collapsing, the propaganda machine is lazy, and the war has been reduced to an accounting exercise where death is rebranded as progress. Putin and Lukashenko talking casually about mass killing as though entire cities were nothing more than spreadsheets. And that is the most chilling part. Evil does not always come dressed in perfectly tailored military uniforms. Sometimes it comes slouched, bored, wrinkled and absurd. But the outcome is the same. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions broken, in a war that drags on not for victory but for vanity, just for the sake of continuing the war itself. That bench in Valam was not just a stage, it was a mirror of a regime that has nothing left to offer but death, disguised as positive dynamics as they call it. And if this is what passes for leadership in 2025, then Russia is not just at war with Ukraine, it is at war with its own future. Well, there you guys, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more news like this. If you wish to support our war, the links down below, for example, Patreon memberships where you can see an additional chapter in the end. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Friday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell, their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they